See rough sawn cedar become a beautiful, standing, heart-shaped dog memorial for an Airedale Terrier today on Vibrant Wood Creations. Today, I'll be making a memorial for an Airedale Terrier. This is a unique and stately dog. Now, most of the time, I get to know the dog's name and I get pictures of the dog and sometimes even amusing stories I can relate. But in this case, I didn't get any of those things, which is the owner's choice, and that's fine. I respect that. So, I'll be giving you some information about the Airedale Terrier as a general breed and kind of talking you through my process and what I do. So I pull a piece of rough sawn eastern red cedar out of the stack. That's in this case what the customer chose. Now this is a very rustic looking wood. It has a tremendous amount of character, which if you like that in wood is fabulous, but it's not for everybody. A lot of wood is fairly homogeneous. Maple, walnut are like this, but eastern red cedar isn't. Even in this very rough sawn board, you can see there are a lot of knots. There's this lighter color, there's a darker tan color. Although, once we get to the machining portion and we get that top layer of wood that's been exposed to the sun and the air for multiple years while drying on my porch, once we get that layer off, it's going to reveal really gorgeous wood beneath. It's red and pink and orange and has lots of beautiful swirls around the knots. It's really quite a looker. What I'm doing here to get started is really just cutting an appropriate section off the end of the board. I'll need a couple of 7 by 7 inch squares for this, and I know that the end of this board has a defect on it, which I'll need to cut off and remove. The rough texture and ridges on this board are clear to see and not typical of modern lumber. Like all my wood, this cedar was a yard tree that had reached the end of its life naturally. Several years ago, I had an assortment of logs like this and hired a portable sawmill to come to my home and turn my collection of logs into slices, frequently called slabs in the world of lumber. The sawer had 4 species to saw that day: white pine, which is soft but resinous and therefore fouls the saw blade; this cedar, which is harder; walnut, a moderately hard wood; and hickory, which is among the hardest domestic woods you are likely to have heard of. The sawer knew that the pine and the hickory would use up the blades the fastest, so he wisely slabbed those logs first. This left him with a functional saw, albeit with a dull blade by the time this cedar log came around, and thus it is roughly sawn. The planer will easily take this rough texture off, revealing fresh wood underneath. Having plentiful knots in this board practically guarantees dramatic swirls and color variations in the final product, but requires more care along the way. The knots are dramatically denser than the surrounding wood, and so have to be planed gently, otherwise hunks may tear out. Woodworkers call this snipe. The true character of this cedar is finally revealed. Color variations swirl around the knots, not unlike the way turbulent flow of water ripples around rocks. It's like the wood version of the Van Gogh painting, Starry Night. If this were walnut, people would pay huge money to have character like this, but in cedar, it just comes as standard equipment. I've got one more trip to the miter saw here to make sure that I'm cutting a piece that is big enough to do what I need to do on the CNC machine, but without wasting anything. From this section of cedar that I have cleaned up, I'm going to get 2 7-inch squares and then cut the end piece off, which I noted earlier does have a bit of a defect in it, and you can see it clearly there. The wood is still very pretty, and it still may be useful for something, but not in a memorial like this. Everything I sell needs to be really structurally sound as well as very attractive, so I'll put that piece aside and I'll probably find a good use for it later. I'm pretty good at saving scraps and using them. I'm marking the exact center of this board. It's important that I know where it is because I'm going to tell the CNC machine where the center of the board is, and then it's going to cut out what I've asked it to cut out around that center point. Using professional grade double-sided woodworking tape for this application, I'm attaching a couple of riser blocks to this cedar so when the bit has cut all the way through, I don't accidentally end up cutting into the CNC table. Instead, The bit will then cut into the little riser blocks. Finally, I'm going to press it down into the table pretty hard to make sure it doesn't shift during cutting. It turns out that the camera's battery died halfway through the CNC machining process, so regrettably, you don't get to see it this time, but this is how it turns out. This part of the process is when things become sentimental. I'm going to add the cremains to the memorial in the carved out paw print. There are lots of choices that people make about what kind of symbols they might want on their memorial. In this case, a paw print was chosen. I think it's a pretty good choice. Cremains, as you can kind of see here, are actually gray, although when mixed with clear resin and poured in, they become a reddish brown. I don't quite know why that is. I pour slowly and carefully to make sure that the resin ends up where I want it, not all over the table. It can make quite a mess, as well as to make sure that I don't create needless bubbles in the final product, even though in this case they won't be seen. People can choose whether they want to see visible cremains in the final product or not. In this case, the owner chose not to be able to see them. So this lower layer of resin has all the cremains in it, and then above it, I'll be mixing and pouring a second decorative layer based on the color that they chose. In this case, it's purple. So that would be mixed up and poured on top. Whereas in the last step, I definitely didn't want anything to overflow from any of the 5 elements of the paw print. In this case, I am going to actually overfill each segment a little bit, and then later I will sand that very top layer off so the resin and the wood are both flush when it's done. This does make a little bit more of a mess, but I think it's the best final effect. Here is a quick view of what the cured resin looks like. You can see the spillover from the previous step. Next, I'm going to run it through the drum sander several times in order to completely flatten the piece out, and then start the fairly laborious process of sanding through many grits to eventually achieve a smooth surface on the wood and a mirror glass-like finish on the resin. Since the sanding process is slow, I'll start telling you a bit more about the Airedale Terrier. The Airedale sits, of course, in the Terrier group. Dogs are roughly divided into 7 different groups, and Terrier is its own unique group. There are 2 groups of dogs specifically based around hunting, the Hound group and the Terrier group, while the Terrier group is the only group specifically centered around what I guess I will call vermin liquidation. Given that today farmers make up about 1% of U.S. households, you can be forgiven for thinking that keeping rodents out of your grain is a big problem. But we don't have to go back very far before it was an enormous problem. In the year 1800, 90% of U.S. households were farmers. Not coincidentally, this is about the time that people began to breed various types of terriers with great vigor. Terriers as a group, aside from their love and special skill at rodent liquidation, all do share a couple of common characteristics. They do tend to be dogs who are on the smaller side. They tend to be vigorous, wiry, brave, and also good at digging. In fact, this is how they got their name. Their name terrier is a version of the Latin word terra, meaning earth. These feisty dogs, in pairs or small groups, would easily live in someone's barn or on their farm, keeping the rodent population at bay. Though it might not be appropriate viewing for everyone in your family, there are videos of terriers, specifically on farms in Australia, doing their jobs very effectively. It is really quite a sight, as is the pile of rodents when they are finished. During my years owning and operating a dog kennel, I learned to see dogs differently than how most people do. Most people are asking themselves several questions, including, is this dog cute? Are they smart? Will it eat the baseboards? My angle as a professional dog handler shifted from this to something a bit more nuanced after working with hundreds and hundreds of different dogs of all shapes, sizes, and ages. Instead, I'm thinking about, Is this dog trying to please me or itself? What is this dog's activity level? Is this dog a good alarm system or guard dog, or neither, or both? And finally, how committed is this dog to singing the song of its people all of the time? I'll get back to terriers in a moment, but I wanted to update you that you can see that the sanding here is almost done, and this is what the memorial looks like once all the excess resin has been sanded off. It's beautifully flat. You can see the purple. However, it needs a great deal of finish sanding. So I'm now going to go through a process where I sand with a variety of different grits, and eventually you'll see that I start dripping water on there to wet sand, which usually goes a little bit better with resin, until I have the glass-like finish on the resin that I'm going for. My experience working with and caring for terriers reveals that they are good dogs, but not easy ones. Terriers are independent spirits and not interested in your agenda or trying to please you. With most of them being on the smaller side, daily walks will go well unless an errant rodent streaks across your path. If so, I hope you have a good grip on the leash. They are generally not interested in fetch. Once your terrier knows that the ball isn't alive and actively squeaking, they lose interest quickly. They are solid alarm systems, if oversensitive ones. Once one has been wound up, it may take a while to settle down again. Quiet, they are not. They have pretty hair, but will need it cut and washed sometimes. Finally, since their heritage is based in helping rodents shuffle off their mortal coil, they are willing to use their teeth if threatened. That being said, I worked with and cared for dozens of terriers, and none of them ever even attempted to bite me. I have finished the extensive sanding process and am cleaning this in preparation for finishing. I use mineral spirits to wipe it off. It effectively cleans all of the residue from sanding off of the memorial while not raising the grain of the wood and drying pretty fast because it's alcohol. Had I been using water, it would have taken 20 minutes for it to dry afterwards, but with mineral spirits, it's just a few. I'm applying just a little bit of a hybrid oil wax-based finish before buffing it in. I apply finish to all sides and surfaces of the memorial. If you don't, ambient humidity from the air, even if you live in a dry part of the country, will slowly seep into the wood and cause one part of the wood to expand, while the other parts remain contracted because the finish protects it. This can ultimately result in damage or even destruction of any wood object. Not being the most common breed of dog, I only ever got to know one Airedale Terrier during my time as a dog boarder. But he was pretty regal. The first time I saw him, he had not had a haircut in a long time, so he presented a little bit like a doodle in his looks, although very much a terrier in his behavior. The second time I saw him, he had just had a haircut, and he really did at that point look like the king of terriers. He had excellent upright posture, lean, muscular body. He had a great looking haircut accentuating his long rectangular snout. He was really a good looking dog. I can understand why Airedales have actually been owned by some pretty famous people. Famous Airedale owners include the successive presidents Wilson, Harding, and Coolidge, the model Bo Derek, actor James Earl Jones, and actor John Wayne. His nickname, the Duke, came from the Airedale he had as a kid. This breed also served in World War I in the British military as sentinels and couriers. One Airedale, Jack, was credited with saving an entire battalion of soldiers by delivering the message that his unit was cut off and needed reinforcements, even after sustaining injuries that would ultimately claim his life. Here's a photo of the terrier we've been talking about as I transition back to woodworking and memorials. The final step in my process, after a great deal of sanding and cleaning and finishing, is to just give it a little buff by hand to get any residual finish off, so that way it can cure properly. I think at this point you can see the shine and the glass-like finish I have in the resin. I think it's a great choice to have purple resin in this wood, as it's got some purple tones in it. As always, I sincerely hope that you do not have an imminent need for a pet memorial, but if you do, I will be here, and I make pretty nice ones. Don't forget to like and subscribe, And if there are any parts of this video that you really liked or really didn't, go ahead and leave me a comment. I am not above hearing your feedback. I sincerely thank you for watching all the way to the end. Have a good one.